The knock was a crack of thunder on a clear day. It wasn't just a sound. It was an end to something. The end of quiet. The end of a life built on being left alone. The cowboy, Silas. He didn't move at first. He just sat there, the weight of his own silence pressing down on him. For 5 years, the only company he'd kept was the wind and the dust. He'd convinced himself that was safer, that a man with no one to lose couldn't be broken. But this knock, it felt different. It felt like a debt coming due. He rose slow, his body a single, coiled muscle of caution. His hand found the cold comfort of the rifle leaning against the wall. He didn't move the curtain. He didn't call out. He just stood there, listening to the wood of his own door groan under a fist that sounded like fate itself. When he finally pulled it open, the night lunged in. It was a physical thing, a rush of cold air and spitting rain that carried a woman with it, hunched against the storm. And clinging to her, like 2 pale leaves on a broken branch, were 2 small children. Their faces were all eyes, wide and dark and bottomless, with a hunger that went past food. She didn't beg. That was the first thing that struck him. Her voice was thin, frayed at the edges, but it didn't plead. It stated a fact. She needed work. Her hands, held out slightly, were steady, even as her whole body seemed to sag with a weariness that could crumble mountains. She talked of sweeping, of mending, of any chore that might earn a crust of bread for the little ones beside her. Silas looked from her face, streaked with rain, to the children. He was a hard man. The world had made him that way. And his first thought was trouble. He'd heard the whispers in town, whispers about outcasts, about people who carried their problems with them like a plague, infecting anyone who showed them a moment of kindness. He saw the intricate beadwork on her worn moccasins, and suspicion coiled tight in his gut. He almost shut the door. He almost turned his back and let the storm swallow them whole. It would have been the easy thing, the safe thing. But then the littlest one, the boy, let out a cough. It wasn't loud. It was a tiny, desperate sound that seemed to tear right through the fabric of the night, a sound that spoke of cold and sickness and the edge of a cliff. That sound cut Silas deeper than any knife ever had. Without a word, he stepped back. He opened the door wider, a silent invitation into the meager warmth of his cabin. He expected tears, a flood of gratitude. He got none. The woman, Elena, moved with a quiet purpose that was more powerful than any thanks. She guided her children to the small hearth, her hands gentle as she chafed the life back into their frozen fingers. Silas watched her. He brought out a loaf of bread, hard and dry, and set it on the table. She took it, broke it, and gave the first piece to her daughter, then the second to her son. She watched them eat, her own face a mask of exhaustion, and didn't take a single bite for herself until they were done. He'd spent years believing that strength was a wall you built around yourself, that being alone meant being untouchable, but watching her, seeing the steel in her spine as she starved for her children, he felt something inside him crack. He was seeing a different kind of strength, a strength not built on walls, but on sacrifice. And in that moment, Silas had no idea that by letting them in, he hadn't just saved them from the storm. He had doomed himself to a much bigger one. The days that followed fell into a strange new rhythm. The silence of the ranch was replaced by new sounds, the soft whisk of Elena's broom against the floorboards, the murmur of old lullabies sung in a tongue that felt as ancient as the rocks outside, and, most surprisingly, the sound of children's laughter. It was a sound Silas hadn't realized his life was missing until it filled the empty corners of his home. He found himself pausing in his work, mending a fence or shoeing a horse just to listen. He'd watch the 2 small children chasing chickens in the yard, their faces bright with a joy he thought the world had beaten out of everyone. It was a fragile music, and he was terrified that if he looked at it too hard, it would vanish. Elena worked from sunup to sundown, her hands never idle. She was a phantom of quiet efficiency. But beneath the calm, Silas saw the fear. He saw it in the way she'd stiffen whenever a rider passed on the distant trail. He saw it in the way her eyes would scan the horizon at dusk, as if she was expecting an army to come pouring over the ridge. She never spoke of it, and he never asked. He was a man who respected locked doors, both in cabins and in people. But the weight of her unspoken terror settled in his own chest, a cold, heavy stone. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that something was following her, and it was only a matter of time before it found its way to his door again. The truth, when it came, didn't come from her. It came from town. He was loading supplies when a neighboring ranch hand, a man named Jeb, pulled him aside. Jeb's eyes were shifty, his voice a low conspiracy. "That woman you got staying with you, Silas," he started, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Silas's boot. "You ought to be careful. Word is, she ain't just some poor widow." Silas's hand tightened on a sack of flour. "What word is that, Jeb?" "The word from Barlow's men," Jeb muttered, glancing around. "They say she's a thief, that she was one of his women, and she ran off with something of his. Something valuable." Jeb leaned in closer. "Barlow ain't the kind of man you steal from, Silas. He's put a price on her head, says he wants her back one way or another." A cold fire started in Silas's gut. He knew of Barlow, a rancher with more land than God and a reputation for cruelty that was whispered about in hushed tones. A man who bought and broke people like horses. Silas said nothing. He just loaded his wagon and rode home, Jeb's words ringing in his ears. When he walked into the cabin, he found Elena by the fire, mending one of his shirts. The needle moved with a precision that was almost hypnotic, but when she looked up, he saw it. The flicker of shame and fear in her eyes told him everything. The rumors were true, or at least part of them were. That night, after the children were asleep, she finally told him. Her voice was barely a whisper, a thread of sound in the dark cabin. She hadn't been Barlow's woman. She had been his tool. Elena wasn't just an outcast. She was a scholar of sorts, one of the few of her people who could read, write, and speak the language of the white man fluently. Barlow had discovered this. He hadn't wanted her for her beauty. He'd wanted her for her mind. He'd forced her to be his translator, to sit in on meetings with tribal elders and twist their words, to help him craft treaties that were nothing more than beautifully written lies. Documents that signed away ancestral lands for pennies on the dollar. She had been the weapon he used to destroy her own people. The debt she owed him wasn't money. It was silence. She had run, not with his silver, but with his secrets. She'd managed to smuggle out a single, half-finished treaty page, proof of his fraud. That piece of paper was why he was hunting her. It wasn't about revenge. It was about tying up a loose end that could unravel his entire empire. She spoke without tears, her dignity a shield against the horror of her own story. Silas listened, the stone in his chest turning into a shard of glass. He had taken her in, thinking he was saving her from starvation. Now he understood he had invited a war into his home. He was sheltering the one person who could burn Jacob Barlow to the ground, and the first tremors of the earthquake were already shaking the prairie. The wind began to howl, a low moan that grew into a shriek, pressing against the cabin walls. Outside, the sky turned a bruised purple. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a slow, menacing drumbeat. The children, sensing the tension in the air, huddled close to their mother. Silas went to the barn. He didn't check on the livestock. He laid out his weapons. He cleaned his rifle, his pistol. He sharpened a knife until the edge gleamed in the lantern light. Every movement was slow, deliberate. He was preparing not for a storm, but for a siege. Elena found him there, her face a pale oval in the flickering light. "They will come," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the rising wind. He will not stop. Silas looked at her, at the raw terror warring with the fierce defiance in her eyes. He looked past her, through the barn door, to the small cabin where her children slept, their cheeks flushed with the warmth of a safety they had never known. He didn't offer empty promises. He didn't say it would be all right. He just gave a single slow nod. A nod that said he understood everything. A nod that said the war she was running from had found a place to make it stand. Right here. The sky ripped open. Lightning spider-webbed across the clouds, illuminating a world gone mad. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid sheets, turning the yard into a churning sea of mud. And through the deluge they appeared. Torches. A string of them, like malevolent fireflies, weaving through the darkness, getting closer and closer. Hoofbeats became a thunder that shook the very ground, a sound that hammered at the door and the heart. Voices, raw and cruel, rose on the wind, calling her name. Elena! Inside, she grabbed her children, pulling them into a tight knot of desperation. Their small bodies trembled uncontrollably. She was trying to shield them from a sound that promised to tear their world apart. Silas stepped to the door. He didn't hesitate. He pulled it open, the wind trying to rip it from his grasp. He stood on the threshold, his rifle held across his chest, his shoulders squared against the howling night. He was one man against an army. He didn't know if he could win. He just knew he wouldn't run. The riders circled the cabin, their horses churning the mud, their faces grotesque masks in the flickering torchlight. They looked like demons spat up from the earth. Their leader, a bull of a man with a scarred face, laughed, a sound like grinding rocks. "Barlow wants his property, old man. Send out the thieving squaw and we'll leave your pathetic excuse for a ranch standing." Silas didn't answer. Words were useless now. These men weren't here to talk. They were here for blood. He stepped out onto the porch, the rain plastering his shirt to his skin, his boots sinking into the muck. He raised the rifle, and he fired. The shot wasn't aimed at any of them. It was a single deafening crack that ripped through the storm's roar. A punctuation mark, a declaration. He fired it into the ground just in front of the lead horse, sending a spray of mud and water into the air. For a single heartbeat, there was silence, save for the storm. Then the scarred man cursed, his face twisting into a snarl. "Wrong answer! Your grave's gonna be a shallow one!" The charge was chaos, a wall of horseflesh and fury plunging through the rain. Silas's rifle cracked again, and this time it found a target. A rider screamed and tumbled from his saddle, vanishing into the darkness. But there were too many. They were on him before he could reload. He fought with a grim, cold precision. This wasn't a fight of passion. It was a fight of mathematics. One bullet, one man. He used the porch for cover, the shadows for an ally. Lightning flashes were his only guide, freezing the scene in terrible, brief tableaus of violence. In one flash, he saw their faces, contorted with hate. In the next, he saw the cabin door, the thin piece of wood that separated life from death. They had mistaken him for a simple, lonely man. An easy target. They didn't know that loneliness had boiled him down to his essential parts. They didn't know that a man with nothing to lose is dangerous. But a man who has just found something to protect is a force of nature. One of them broke through. A wiry man with a knife clenched in his teeth. He vaulted onto the porch and kicked the cabin door open. He lunged inside, a triumphant roar on his lips. But he was met with a specter. Elena stood there. Her hair had come unbound, a wild black mane around her face. Her shawl was gone. In her hands, she gripped a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, its tip glowing a faint red. Her eyes were not the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of a cornered wolf, blazing with a fury that promised nothing but pain. She didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She planted her feet between the intruder and her children, and she swung. The sound of iron meeting bone was sickeningly loud, followed by a choked scream. The man staggered back, clutching his head, and Silas was there to meet him, the butt of his rifle driving the man off the porch and into the mud. He caught her eye for a fraction of a second. The woman who had come to his door asking for work was gone. In her place was a warrior. The fight devolved into a brutal close-quarters brawl. The yard was a maelstrom of mud, fists, and flashing steel. A bullet grazed Silas's shoulder, a searing line of fire. He ignored it. He shoved one attacker into the path of another's horse. He used his empty rifle like a club, his movements economical and deadly. Through the roaring in his ears, one thought pulsed. Protect the cabin. Protect them. Then, a new sound. Faint at first. More gunshots, but from a different direction. Lanterns, bobbing lights appearing over the crest of the nearest hill. It was Jeb, and a few other ranchers from the valley. They'd heard the shots and had come to investigate. They weren't an army, but they were enough. The attackers saw it too. The tide had turned, the odds had shifted, curses filled the air. They were hired thugs, not soldiers. They were paid to bully, not to die in a pitched battle. Their leader screamed a retreat, and as quickly as they had appeared, they began to melt back into the storm-racked darkness. Silence fell, thick and heavy, broken only by the whimpering of the children and the steady drumming of the rain. Silas stood in the center of the yard, chest heaving, his body a collection of aches and burning pain. He slowly lowered his rifle, its barrel hot to the touch. The cabin door opened. Elena stepped out, her children clinging to her legs. Her eyes found his across the ruined yard. No words were spoken. None were needed. In the heart of the storm, something had been forged between them, a bond of blood and fire and rain. They were no longer a man and a refugee. They were survivors. They were a fortress. But as he looked out into the darkness where the riders had fled, he knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. They hadn't won the war. They had just survived the first shot, and Barlow would be back. Dawn broke over a landscape that looked like it had been scrubbed clean by the storm. Puddles reflected a pale, washed-out sky. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of herbs and coffee. Elena was tending to the gash on Silas's shoulder. Her touch was impossibly gentle for someone who had wielded an iron poker like a weapon of war just hours before. She worked in silence, her brow furrowed in concentration. The children, their terror replaced by a wide-eyed awe, sat close to Silas, occasionally reaching out to touch his arm, as if to confirm he was real. He had been a stranger. Now he was their rock, their protector. He had bled for them. In a child's world, there is no stronger bond. Silas looked at the scene. The woman tending his wounds, the children who looked at him with absolute trust. He felt a shift deep inside him, a tectonic plate moving for the first time in years. The lonely man he had been was gone, washed away in the night's deluge. In his place was someone else, a man with a family, a man with a purpose beyond just seeing the next sunrise. And that terrified him more than Barlow's entire army. But there was a new problem, a much bigger one. As he was cleaning up the yard, clearing away the debris from the fight, he found it half buried in the mud near where one of the riders had fallen. It was a leather satchel. Inside, soaked but still legible, was a map. It wasn't a map of his ranch. It was a map of the entire valley. His homestead was marked with a red X, but so were half a dozen others. Jeb's place, the old Miller farm, the widow Jensen's spread. Next to each X was a notation: foreclosure, debt default, boundary dispute. It was Barlow's battle plan, a systematic campaign to seize the whole valley using manufactured debts and legal trickery. The attack on his ranch hadn't been a simple act of revenge. It was a test, a proof of concept. If Barlow could crush him and take Elena, he could do it to anyone. They were just the first domino. Silas brought the map inside and spread it on the table. Elena looked at it, her face going pale. She traced the lines with her finger, her knowledge of Barlow's methods filling in the horrifying gaps. "He is not just a rancher," she said, her voice low. "He is a king building an empire." They were no longer safe. The ranch wasn't a fortress, it was a target. Barlow wouldn't send thugs next time. He'd send an army, or worse, a corrupt sheriff with a warrant. They couldn't stay, but they couldn't run. Running meant letting Barlow win, letting him swallow the valley whole. The piece of the treaty Elena had saved, the map they had just found. They were holding the two things that could expose Barlow for the monster he was. But holding them here was a death sentence. "There's a territorial judge," Silas said, the plan forming in his mind even as he spoke. "In Prescott, an honest man, they say, Judge Miller." It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. Prescott was 100 miles away, across harsh, unforgiving country, and they would be hunted every step of the way. Elena looked from the map to her children, now sleeping soundly in the corner, blissfully unaware of the storm that was still gathering. Her face was a canvas of fear and resolve. She knew what he was asking. It was a suicide mission. But staying was a slower, more certain kind of death. She met his gaze and gave a single, firm nod, the same nod he had given her in the barn. An understanding that passed without words, a promise to see this through to whatever bitter end it led them. They left that night. They took only what they could carry on 2 horses, food, water, ammunition, and the 2 pieces of paper that held the fate of the valley. Silas looked back at his ranch one last time, the small cabin looking fragile and lonely under the vast, starry sky. He had come there seeking solitude. He was leaving it with a family, hunted and on the run, with the most powerful man in the territory trying to kill him. He had thought the fight was over. Now he knew the real war had just begun. The trail to Prescott was a harsh, unforgiving beast. By day, the sun beat down, baking the earth into a cracked, dusty wasteland. By night, the cold seeped into their bones, a chilling reminder of how exposed they were. They traveled mostly in the dark, using the moon and stars as their guide, resting during the hottest parts of the day in hidden arroyos or thickets of brush. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Silas pushed them hard, his senses on a knife's edge. He taught Elena how to use a pistol, her hands surprisingly steady. He showed the children how to be quiet, how to read the tracks of animals, turning the dangerous journey into a game to keep their fear at bay. The children were resilient. They adapted to the hardship with a simple trust that both humbled and terrified Silas. They started calling him not Mister, but by his name. And the way the little girl, Sona, would reach for his hand when she was scared, sent a jolt through him every time. It was a feeling he had long since buried, the feeling of being needed. One evening, huddled around a tiny, smokeless fire, Elena began to tell him her story. Not the story of Barlow, but the story of her life before. She spoke of her father, a wise chief who believed knowledge was a bridge, not a weapon. He had insisted she learn the white man's tongue, their ways, not to assimilate, but to understand, to protect their people. He was the one who had taught her that dignity was the one thing no one could take from you. "He would be ashamed of what I did," she whispered, staring into the flames. "I helped Barlow. I was his voice." "You were a prisoner, Elena," Silas said, his voice rough. "You did what you had to do to survive, to protect them." He nodded toward the sleeping children. "There's no shame in that." His words seemed to lift a weight from her. She looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight, and for the first time, he saw not a refugee or a warrior, but just a woman. And in that moment, the wall he had kept around his own heart for so many years began to crumble. Their journey was interrupted 3 days later. They were making their way through a narrow canyon when Silas, scouting ahead, saw them. 3 riders, silhouetted against the morning sky, Barlow's men. They hadn't given up the chase. They were trackers, and they were good. Silas scrambled back, his heart pounding. "They've found us!" Panic flared in Elena's eyes, but she quickly smothered it. What do we do? There was no time to run, no place to hide. The canyon walls were steep and bare. They were caught. But Silas saw a narrow fissure, a game trail that led up the side of the canyon. It was a treacherous climb, but it was their only chance. "Get the children," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Climb. Don't stop until you reach the top, and don't look back." He pressed the pistol into her hand. "If they get past me, you know what to do." Her hand trembled as she took the gun. The unspoken meaning hung heavy in the air between them. He was telling her to protect the children, no matter the cost. He was preparing to die so they could live. She wanted to argue, to refuse, but she saw the look in his eyes. It was the same look he'd had on the porch during the storm, the look of a man who had already made his peace with the world. She grabbed the children and started scrambling up the rocks. Silas took his position behind a cluster of boulders, his rifle resting on the stone. He was 1 man against 3, in a battle he couldn't win. He watched Elena and the children, 2 small figures pulling a smaller one, getting higher and higher. He just needed to buy them time. The riders entered the canyon, moving slow, their eyes scanning the ground. They hadn't seen him yet. Silas took a deep breath, let it out slow. He centered the rifle's sight on the chest of the lead rider. He said a silent prayer, and he squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the canyon like the crack of doom. The lead rider was thrown from his horse. The other 2 scattered, diving for cover, their own guns blazing. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around Silas, sending stone chips flying like shrapnel. He was pinned down. He fired back, but it was a desperate exchange. He was buying minutes, maybe seconds. He risked a glance up the canyon wall. Elena and the children were almost at the top. Just a little more time. A bullet struck the rock next to his head, and the impact sent a shard of granite into his cheek, opening a bloody gash. The world swam for a second. He knew he was done. The 2 riders were advancing now, moving from cover to cover, closing in. He had 1 bullet left in the rifle. He took aim, knowing it would be his last shot. Suddenly, another shot rang out, but it wasn't from his rifle or from the men below. It came from above. One of the advancing riders cried out and fell, clutching his leg. Silas looked up in disbelief. At the top of the canyon ridge stood Elena. She was holding the pistol with both hands, smoke curling from its barrel. She hadn't run. She had climbed to higher ground and entered the fight. The remaining rider, confused, looked up at her, exposing himself for a fatal second. Silas didn't waste it. His last bullet found its mark. The canyon fell silent, the echoes of gunfire slowly fading away, replaced by the whisper of the wind. He sat there, gasping for breath, his shoulders screaming in protest, blood trickling down his face. He looked up at Elena, a silhouette against the bright blue sky. She had saved his life. The woman he had set out to protect had just become his protector. When they finally met at the top of the ridge, breathless and trembling, he reached out and touched the gash on his cheek. "You're a hell of a shot," he managed, a weak grin on his face. "You are a terrible listener," she replied, her voice shaking, but a small smile touched her lips. "I was not going to leave you." In the silence of that canyon, surrounded by the ghosts of their enemies, they both knew that the journey had changed. It was no longer about a man helping a woman and her children. They were a unit, a family, forged in the crucible of violence and survival, and together they might just be strong enough to see the sunrise in Prescott. But their greatest challenge, a betrayal they could never see coming, was waiting for them just over the horizon. They found the old prospector by a small, hidden spring, his mule grazing peacefully nearby. He was a gnarled man with a beard like a tumbleweed and eyes that had seen a century of sun and sorrow. He watched them approach not with fear, but with a quiet curiosity. They were wary at first, but the man, who called himself Jedediah, offered them water and a piece of jerky, his kindness a balm on their frayed nerves. As they sat, sharing a small fire, Jedediah's gaze kept drifting to Elena, specifically to the intricate beadwork on the hem of her worn shawl. "That pattern," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "Haven't seen that in 30 years. Not since the great chief, Blackhawk, tried to rally the tribes. He said the 3 circles represented the past, the present, and the future, all bound together." Elena stared at him, her eyes wide. "That was my father's symbol." Jedediah's eyebrows shot up. He looked from her to the children, then back again. "Blackhawk's daughter?" I thought. Everyone thought his line ended when he was killed. He told them a story then, a story that filled in the missing pieces of Elena's past. Her father hadn't just been a wise chief. He had been a visionary. He had foreseen the tide of men like Barlow and had tried to create a unified front of tribes to negotiate from a position of strength, not desperation. But he was betrayed by his own people, men who were swayed by promises of government silver. He was murdered, his legacy erased, his family scattered. Elena had been a child. She had been taken in by a distant relative, her heritage hidden for her own protection. She had grown up believing she was simply the daughter of a minor hunter. Now, sitting by this hidden spring, she learned she was the heir to a legacy of resistance. She wasn't just Elena, the translator. She was the daughter of Black Hawk. The unbreakable spirit she possessed wasn't just her own. It was an inheritance. This revelation changed everything. It wasn't just her life on the line. It was the memory of her father. The fight against Barlow was no longer just about survival, or even justice for the valley. It was about honoring the past and fighting for the future her father had envisioned. With renewed purpose, they finally reached the outskirts of Prescott. It wasn't the sanctuary they had hoped for. The town was booming, chaotic, and bristling with an energy that felt dangerous. Barlow's influence was everywhere. His name was on the side of the biggest saloon, on the sacks of flour in the general store. He wasn't just a rancher, he owned this town, body and soul. They found Judge Miller's office tucked away on a side street. It was a modest building, a stark contrast to Barlow's gilded saloons. Leaving Elena and the children hidden in a nearby boarding house, Silas went in alone, the map and the treaty page clutched in his hand. The judge was an older man with a kind face and tired eyes. He listened patiently as Silas laid out the entire story: the lies, the siege, the map, the murderous pursuit. He examined the documents carefully, his brow furrowed. For a moment, Silas felt a glimmer of hope. Here was the honest man they had risked everything to find. "This is a very serious accusation, son," Judge Miller said, leaning back in his chair. He sighed, a heavy, weary sound. "And I believe you. I've had my suspicions about Mr. Barlow for some time." Relief washed over Silas, so potent it almost made him dizzy. "So you'll help us? You'll issue a warrant?" The judge looked at the door to his office, then back at Silas. He lowered his voice. "I can't. The marshal? He's Barlow's man, the deputies? They're on his payroll. If I issue a warrant, you'll be dead before the ink is dry, and these documents," he tapped the papers on his desk, "will disappear forever." The glimmer of hope died, replaced by a cold, hard dread. They were trapped. They had walked right into the heart of the spider's web. "Barlow is more than a man. He's a system," the judge continued. "But there is one chance. In 2 days, the territorial delegates are meeting here in Prescott. They're deciding on routes for the new railroad. Barlow is giving the keynote address. He plans to convince them to run the line straight through the valley, through the lands he's acquiring. A plan desperate and insane, began to form in Silas's mind. If someone, the judge said, his eyes meeting Silas's with a clear, unspoken meaning, were to present this evidence in a public forum, in front of the delegates, in front of the press, Barlow couldn't make it disappear. He couldn't kill the story. He was telling them to walk into the lion's den, to confront Barlow in the middle of his coronation. It was suicide. But it was the only move they had left. Silas walked out of the judge's office, the weight of their impossible task pressing down on him. He had brought Elena and her children all this way, chasing a phantom of justice, only to lead them to a place where the law was just another weapon in the enemy's arsenal. Now, they had to stand up in front of the most powerful men in the territory and take on a king in his own court, with nothing but the truth as their shield. And the truth, Silas knew, was often the first casualty in a war. The Grand Hotel was the crown jewel of Prescott, and its ballroom was the heart of Barlow's power. It was filled to bursting with delegates, investors, and reporters, all gathered to hear the great Jacob Barlow lay out his vision for the future, a future built on the bones of his victims. Getting in was the first impossibility. But Judge Miller, their silent conspirator, had provided 2 invitations meant for a rancher who had mysteriously taken ill. Silas, cleaned up and wearing a borrowed suit that felt like a cage, looked like just another landowner. Elena, in a simple but dignified dress, could have been his wife. They moved through the crowd, a sea of cigar smoke and self-importance, feeling like ghosts at a feast. The children were hidden away with the judge's wife, a kind woman who promised to keep them safe, but the fear for them was a constant physical ache in Elena's chest. Barlow took the stage to thunderous applause. He was a big man, radiating a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He spoke of progress, of taming the wilderness, of a future of prosperity for all. His words were smooth, persuasive, and utterly false. He held the map, a clean, professionally drawn version of the one Silas had found in the mud, and used it to illustrate the path of his proposed railroad. "This valley," Barlow boomed, his voice filling the room, "is largely uninhabited, save for a few stubborn squatters and remnants of a dying people. It is a blank canvas, waiting for the brushstroke of progress." That was their cue. Silas moved first, stepping into the main aisle. "That's a lie," he shouted, his voice rough and out of place in the opulent room. A hush fell. Every head turned to look at him. Barlow paused, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face before being replaced by an amused smile. "Well, it seems one of the stubborn squatters has found his voice. Security, please escort this man out." 2 burly deputies started toward Silas, but before they could reach him, Elena stepped forward. "He is not a squatter," she said. Her voice, clear and steady, carried a quiet authority that cut through the tension. "He is a landowner, and the people you call remnants have names. They have histories." Barlow's smile faltered. He recognized her. His eyes narrowed into slits of pure venom. I should have known. This is a desperate ploy by a known thief and liar." "Am I a liar?" Elena asked, taking another step forward. She held up the tattered piece of treaty. "Then is this document a lie? The one you forced me to translate, promising my people protection while stealing the ground from beneath their feet?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reporters began scribbling furiously in their notebooks. "And is this map a lie?" Silas called out, holding up the muddy, blood-stained original. "The one your men carried when they came to murder this woman and her children? The one that shows your plan to steal every ranch in this valley through fraud and intimidation?" He threw the map onto the stage, and it landed at Barlow's feet. The contrast between the dirty, battle-worn document and the polished man was stark. Barlow laughed, a desperate hollow sound. "These are forgeries, lies concocted by a fugitive and a fool." But the seed of doubt had been planted. The delegates were murmuring, looking from the confident man on the stage to the determined pair in the aisle. "My name is Elena," she said, her voice ringing with a power she hadn't known she possessed. "And I am the daughter of Black Hawk." A wave of shock went through the room. The older delegates, the ones who knew the territory's history, knew that name. It was a name of honor, of resistance. "My father taught me that words have power," she continued, her eyes locked on Barlow. "You used my words to weave a web of lies. Tonight I use my own to tell the truth. Jacob Barlow is not a pioneer. He is a thief. He is a tyrant. And this is the proof." Suddenly, the ballroom doors burst open. It was Jeb, the ranch hand from Silas's valley. And behind him stood a dozen other ranchers, the Millers, the Jensens, all the people whose homes had been marked on Barlow's map. Judge Miller had sent for them. They had ridden all night to be there. "She's telling the truth," Jeb shouted. "Barlow's been trying to squeeze us out for years. We were too scared to speak up alone, but we ain't alone anymore." The room erupted into chaos. The delegates were on their feet, shouting questions. The reporters surged toward the stage. Barlow, his face pale with fury and panic, was trapped. His web of lies had been torn apart in a matter of minutes. The deputies, seeing the tide turn, hesitated, unwilling to defend a man whose empire was crumbling before their eyes. Justice, in the end, didn't come from a gun or a judge's gavel. It came from a story told by a woman who had found her voice and a man who had found something worth fighting for. They returned to the valley not as fugitives, but as heroes. Barlow's empire collapsed under the weight of federal investigations. His corrupt officials were arrested, his land holdings seized, and in many cases, returned to their rightful owners. The ranch was still there, waiting for them. It looked different now. It was no longer a refuge from the world, but a part of it, a place of beginning. Life found a new, gentler rhythm. The sound of children's laughter became the heartbeat of the homestead. Elena became a leader in her own right, a respected voice who worked to build the bridge of understanding her father had always dreamed of. One evening, as the sun set, painting the prairie in hues of orange and purple, Silas stood with her on the porch. The children were asleep inside. The land was quiet, peaceful. He finally said the words that had been sitting in his heart for 100 miles. He asked her to be his wife, not out of duty, not out of pity, but from a love that had been forged in a storm and tempered in fire. Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded, her hand finding his. The empty spaces in Silas, the hollows carved out by loneliness and loss, were finally filled. They had faced the worst of the world, and had not only survived, but had built something new in the wreckage, a family, a future. They knew more storms would come. The world was not a gentle place, but standing there together, they were not afraid. They were a fortress, built not of stone and wood, but of courage and love. And no storm could ever tear that down. If you were on the edge of your seat listening to Silas and Elena's story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the incredible tales of survival and justice we have coming your way.